I feel kind of shortchanged, you know. I was supposed to go first. Marco goes first, and are there any protesters left? Come on. If there's anybody left, we could start with the protest and just get it out of the way. In fact, if there's a protester left in the room, I'll take the first question right now from a protester. Anybody left? Disappointing. I think there are some big issues that go beyond maybe some of the superficial issues of the day. And one of the issues that I think is a big and recurring issue and occurred to our founding fathers and really has occurred to civilized men and women probably since the beginning of time. And that is, are liberty and virtue mutually exclusive? Are they incompatible? Can you have one without the other? Can you have liberty without virtue? Now, Washington didn't seem to think so, and most of our framers didn't seem to think so. Washington said, in fact, that democracy requires a virtuous people. Ronald Reagan would agree with him. Ronald Reagan said that freedom and faith are so intertwined that you should never attempt to decouple them. A friend of mine, Don Devine, who was in the Reagan administration, wrote a book called America's Way Back. And he said that the great achievement of our framers was that they synthesized freedom and tradition. He said that freedom requires tradition for law and order, for inspiration. But the tradition requires freedom to escape stagnation, to escape coercion and decline. That really you have to have a dose of both. That one without the other isn't something that we strive for. When I think of how do we compare different ways of mixing liberty and virtue, I think of how different the American Revolution was from the French Revolution. In the American Revolution, we threw off the yoke of the king, but we kept our religious bearing. Some people will say, and this is a perfect gotcha question from the media, are we a Christian nation? Well, we were founded by a people that were predominantly Christian, a people that were predominantly religious, and kept their religion as part of their tradition. We also kept the democratic representation. We kept the House of Burgess, had been going on 150 years. So when we had our revolution, we were remarkably lucky that it turned out as well as it did. But I think part of it is we sought more freedom, but we didn't give up on our traditions. We didn't give up on believing that we had to have a virtuous nation, that there had to be an underpinning or an undergirding coming from something beyond us, that we believe that our rights actually came from God and couldn't be taken away. I ask the kids that come to Washington every week, the ones I'll take a picture with, I have like 5 minutes with them on the steps of the Capitol, and I'll say, are we a republic or a democracy? And they get it right about half the time, which, you know, we could improve some of our education. But the thing is that it's an important question, because if you believe in a constitutional republic, you believe that our rights come naturally from God and that a majority shouldn't take them away from us. Os Guinness is a theologian, and he talks about, in a book that I highly recommend, The Suicide of a Free People, he talks about how liberty requires restraint, but the only restraint consistent with liberty is self-restraint. That you have to voluntarily, so it's sort of like the question, can government save you? Nobody in the room believes that. Can government perfect your life? Can government be the end all? The reason I ask these questions is so often I meet with pastors and ministers and they're looking to government for the answers, and I look back at them and I'm saying, I'm looking to you for help. The thing is what's the number one linkage of a problem to poverty in our country? And we say, well, poverty is a public policy. We should do something publicly to fix poverty. The number one link is having kids without being married. But I can't make you get married, all right? I can't do that. The government can't do it. But it doesn't mean someone shouldn't say that it's appropriate and necessary and that it's important. So really it needs to be a combination. It needs to be both a combination of a religious people in government who are religious, pastors. It needs to be a combination of all the above, and there's not nearly enough. We had the shooting this morning in South Carolina. What kind of person goes in a church and shoots 9 people? There's a sickness in our country. There's something terribly wrong. but it isn't going to be fixed by your government. It's people straying away. It's people not understanding where salvation comes from. And I think that if we understand that, we'll understand and have better expectations of what we get from our government. But I'll give you an understanding, or maybe a little bit, of how I feel let down sometimes by my government. I spent most of my life as a physician. I trained for 10 years, practiced for 20 years, and still consider it to be my primary role in life is that I'm going to continue doing surgery. I'll do surgery on Friday for people who don't have insurance in Paducah, Kentucky. I'll be in Haiti during August doing surgery. So it's what I want to do, and it's a talent that I think I have that I can give back. But at the same time, when I look to government and I say, well, government, for instance, shouldn't do bad things. At the very least, we should agree not to do bad things. In Foreign Relations Committee about, this has probably been 6 months ago, I said, you know what? Maybe at the very least, we shouldn't give our money to countries that persecute Christians. If you ask that question, not just here in this audience, which I know understands and has a religious faith, but if you ask that question anywhere in America outside the Beltway, it's a 95, maybe a 99% question. So here's my amendment. My amendment says that any country that puts Christians to death for speaking their mind on religion, for changing their religion to Christianity, or for interfaith marriage, we shouldn't give them a penny, not one penny. You know what the vote was? 18-2 against my amendment. What we have is a Congress and your representatives so out of touch that I put forward something I think is easy to answer. We're borrowing $1 million a minute. We hardly have money for anything if you look at it. But couldn't we start, by not giving money to countries that hate us, burn our flag, and persecute Christians? $18-2 to continue doing it. So last week I decided I'd give them another test. And it's been annoying me to no end that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have a unified government, and yet Hamas continues to launch missiles against Israel. So I said, well, really, why would we be giving money, and we do, but a lot of people don't realize this, why would we be giving money to a unified government who may well in reality be using that directly or indirectly to buy missiles to fire them against one of our best allies? So I said, why don't we halt the aid, and they can have it back, because you always have to have some sort of give it back to them. We give it back to them if they recognize Israel, renounce violence, and quit doing what they've been doing and honor all the international treaties with regard to recognizing Israel. You know how many votes I got this time? I got a few more, but the vote was still like 15-5. See, the thing is not only do they believe we should give away your money to other countries, they believe we should give it away regardless of the behavior. They say, this is how we're going to project our power, and this is how we're going to influence the behavior of nations. And I said, well, if you don't have any restrictions on it, you're not influencing anybody. You're just giving away the money. But it's been going on year in, year out, and Washington is so, distant from the people, they don't understand this. And this is your real problem. So I'm convinced it's never getting better unless we do a couple of things. We need to limit every one of their terms and send them home. Every one of them. Now that would be some good and some bad would go home, but since mostly we've got a disproportionate amount of bad versus good up here, that overall term limits would be a good idea. And that's not directed towards one individual or anything. It's not about one person. It's about changing the system. After FDR, we decided that more than 2 terms was just too much for the president. So we limited the president to 2 terms, and it passed overwhelmingly. I'm convinced if the American people were ever allowed to vote on term limits, it's an 80% issue. Look at any poll. If I go to a crowd that's half Republican, half Democrat, the only thing that unifies them is their disdain for Congress. So I think we should go ahead and consider again whether, how long we keep people up here. The other thing is that the inertia is so strong. And power, they say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They're absolutely right. And there's too much power up here. The biggest problem, people say, what's the worst thing the president's done? What's this? It's the collapse. It's a long list. So I'm only going to get into generalities. It's the biggest problem the president has confronted us with as a people is the collapse of the separation of powers. Madison said that we would pit ambition against ambition. We would have co-equal branches of government, and that Congress would jealously guard their power against the president taking that power and vice versa. Montesquieu, one of the philosophers that they looked to, said that when the executive begins to legislate, then a form of tyranny will ensue. So the problem we have is we've got a president who writes his own legislation on immigration, he writes his own legislation on health care, he writes his own legislation on War Powers Act, he's been collecting your phone records without our permission, and even though we told him not to last week, he's petitioned the court to continue doing explicitly what we told him not to do last week. So this is a president run amok with power. I'm reminded of what Lincoln said. Lincoln said that any man can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man, give him power. The reason I'm running for president is not to gain power or glory for myself. The reason I'm running for president is to take power away from government and give it back to the people. I think we succeed as a movement and as a party when we figure out how to take our message to new people. I tell people we need to be the party of the entire Bill of Rights. We need to take it to people who haven't been hearing that message. Some say, oh no, what we need to do is just dilute our message and be more like the Democrats, and then we'll get more votes. I think it's the opposite. I think we need to engage conservatives and say, we're going to be as conservative as we promised. We are going to be as conservative as we promised. We are going to be boldly for what we are for. But then we have to figure out what parts of our message might apply to people who haven't been listening to it. So I spent the last year going to Howard University, going to south side of Chicago, going to Philadelphia and Baltimore and Ferguson, and saying, I want to be the candidate. I want to be the party that's for the entire Bill of Rights. Everybody's for the Second Amendment. All 55 candidates running for president are for the Second Amendment on our side. But the thing is that a lot of young people, that may not be their primary issue. But they do like the right to privacy that was enshrined in the Fourth Amendment. So I've tried to champion that I'm all for looking at the records of terrorists, but I want to do it with a warrant, with a judge's name on it, with suspicion, but not indiscriminately on everyone. With your phone records, 85% of the time they can tell what your religion is. Do we really want that information floating around the President Obama's White House? We've seen what he's done to Tea Party groups. We've seen what he's done to religious liberty. It's not just about him, though. It's about giving that power to any president, a power that could be abused. If we're for the entire Bill of Rights, not just the Second Amendment, it's the Fourth Amendment, which is your right to privacy. But it's also the Fifth and Sixth Amendment, which I say is about justice. It's about everybody being treated equally under the law, regardless of the color of your skin. It is about minority rights. We should be the party of minority rights. But here's the interesting thing. You can be a minority because of the color of your skin or the shade of your ideology. You can be a minority because you teach your kids at home. You can be a minority because you still believe in right and wrong and you go to a church that wants to express right and wrong. You can be a minority because you're an evangelical Christian. You can be a minority for a variety of rights. That's why we're a constitutional republic. And we need to ensure that the protection of your freedoms, the protections of your rights is never allowed to be manipulated or distorted or destroyed or taken away from you by a majority. We need to be the party of the entire Bill of Rights. And I'll conclude with one story that shows you how this message of the Bill of Rights really is about some people maybe you might not have met before. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old black kid from the Bronx. He died last weekend. And it makes me profoundly sad to think about what happened to him. He was accused of a crime in the Bronx. He was put in prison for 3 years without a trial. The person who accused him of the crime was not here in the country legally, changed their story many times and never showed up. He was never, ever tried. He was finally released after 3 years in prison with no trial, essentially considered innocent because there was never any charge brought. There was a charge, but never ever trial. In prison, he was in solitary confinement for 2 years. He couldn't make bail. He was from a poor family. He was beaten by gangs in prison. He tried to commit suicide in prison several times and then unfortunately was finally successful last week. The thing is that should never happen in America. You should never be in jail for 3 years without a trial. The Sixth Amendment says you have the right to a speedy trial. What I'm here to tell you is that we're going to be the biggest, most dominant party that wins all elections when we say we're going to protect the Sixth Amendment just as much as we're going to protect the Second Amendment. Paul Kenger tells the story of an 11-year-old boy who came home one day and he saw his father passed out drunk on the front porch. This boy had been to school in 17 different school districts, comes home, sees his dad passed out drunk in the snow on the front porch. This young boy was 11 years old. He could have gone inside, he could have gone somewhere else and pretended like it wasn't his dad. But he reached down and grabbed his dad by the overcoat, drug him in and put him to bed. This young man had something special about him, and that's what we need to be looking for. This young man turned out to be Ronald Reagan, who grew up in a difficult home life, but turned out to be one of our greatest leaders because he had strength of character, he had resolve, and he had this sunny optimism that brought Democrats and non-Republicans to the party. When we find that again, we'll win. I want to be part of it, and I hope you do too. Thanks for having me.